and we rapid speed down to 2,500.
Good point. Wherever you reduce speed to 180.
Blackbox.
Hello, gang. Welcome back to KP's Blackbox. Today, I'm going stag. I'm going to be doing this by myself, which is a little weird because usually I'm talking to someone across the way here. But I'm going to talk to you today about financial strategies, financial concepts, and maybe just show you some proof of what I refer to as myth conceptions, and I'm not stuttering. The myth being that returns in our equities markets have been higher over the last 100 years than what, or actually I should say have been lower than what most people actually perceive, because in the general market we've been told certain things and we've been expected to believe certain things. And I want to just kind of lay some of this out for you today, and I'm going to have a couple examples for you to look at, just to make sure that you understand, in the world of finance, the biggest thing to remember is that money is not math, and math is not money. I learned that a long time ago from the guy that created the system that we use called LEAP. His name's Robert Castellone. You can go look him up. But I want to just, again, try to simplify some thoughts today that'll just help you, maybe encourage you when you're thinking about saving, investing through three different phases of life as we see it. The accumulation phase, your distribution phase, and your legacy phase. And through those phases, one of the things that I've learned over 30 years now of being a financial professional is that money can really only flow through 27 different places. And we have structured that in our world and how we help clients in our financial business in three macro components, or maybe we call them three buckets or boxes, depending on who you're talking to. But those three macro boxes could be split into protection, savings, and growth. And there are a few people in our industry that will say very similar things, and they'll have a different word for those, or maybe they'll call them buckets or silos. But the concept here, that concepts sometimes turn into strategies, sometimes turn into plans. The concept is to understand the movement of money through your different boxes, silos, vehicles, instruments, whatever you refer to those financial things in your world. I want to just walk you through today some of the factors of saving money. And so in the back side of the studio, I've got Cody in the dungeon running the calculator for me, and I'm just going to have him bring it up on the screen. We're going to talk through it, and then I'm going to maybe draw a couple of pictures here on the iPad. And so we're just going to give you a lesson today in today's conversation in the history of markets, from large cap stocks all the way down to looking at the impact of inflation. So Cody, let's start by bringing up the versatile calculator. And if you can bring it up here on the screen for me. What I'm going to have Cody do is start the conversation in the top left half of the screen here. We're just going to start with a present value of $10,000. And what I want to show here is that if a person had $10,000 at some given period, and we're going to talk through the start period and the end period, what that money would have grown to in a test tube of different indexes or different financial vehicles. And so the one that comes to mind first and foremost is I hear folks say, well, Kenny, what I've been told is that I just put money in a mutual fund. It's going to earn over the long term 12%, and that 12% compounded at a compounded rate of return is going to yield me a very good retirement. So that's really all I have to do is just have the time value of money, have time, have a value that grows, and at a compounding rate, we're going to end up with significant money in the future. And conceptually, you're right, that would be true. But I want to go through and let's just study that for a minute. So as we saw Cody put here, and Cody, let's go start age of just 1. And it's not really an age we're going to look at here. It's just a time frame. It's years. And we're going to go out 100 years. And so in order to go back 100 years, we have to look at one specific index that we can measure, and that's the Dow Industrials. Now, some of you are going to be watching this and go, oh, Kenny, that's old school. Why are you using the Dow? It's because I don't have data on the S&P 500 going back 100 years. And I'll show you that in just a second. So, Cody, let's go in and turn historical rates on. And there you go, large cap. We're going to come down until we see Dow Jones Industrial. Now, do me a favor, Cody. Up there at the I, where it says asset type, let's go through and set the standard for what we're going to talk through today. So click on that, and then let's go find the Dow. So Dow Jones, right in the middle of your screen there in the black box, it says Dow Jones Industrial Average. This includes, over this 100-year period, it includes the reinvestment of dividends. So this is assuming that your dividends were put back into the Dow Industrial Average to make the compounded growth, okay? And then while we're here, let's start with the other indexes that we're going to look at today. Large cap stocks. Large cap stocks would identify the S&P 500 composite or total return. That includes the reinvestment of dividends. So in all of these scenarios, as it relates to stocks and investments, it's going to include reinvesting your dividends. There are some returns and some calculations that will be exclusive of dividends versus inclusive. So large cap stocks, Standard & Poor's 500 composite total return, including dividends. Mid cap stocks, we're going to be talking about Standard & Poor's 400 composite. So the top 400 companies total return, also including reinvestment of dividends. Small cap stocks, we now expand those companies to 600 companies and their composite total return that also includes dividends. The Dow we already talked about. The NASDAQ is the composite of the entire index, or the NASDAQ quoting system. Corporate bonds, this is going to be the Board of Governors Federal Reserve System as reported to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis is how we pick up the corporate bond yield. Government bonds is going to be looking at 10-year treasuries and the averages on those 10-year treasuries looked at in an annual output. T-bills is, again, the Board of Governors Federal Reserve System reported by the Reserve Bank of St. Louis. U.S. inflation is going to be the U.S. Department of Labor and Bureau of Labor Statistics is where we're getting that data from. CA inflation has to do with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development as reported by the Fed Reserve. So it's just a little different interpretation of inflation. And then we're going to have some what we would refer to typically as like lifestyle portfolios. 80-20, 70-30, 60-40, 40-60, 20-80, And again, the 80% in the very first is going to represent large cap stocks, 20% would represent government bonds, so forth and so on, all the way down to the inverse. 2080 would be large cap stocks at 20%, and then government bonds representing 80%. So what we're going to do first is that most people think of the index as reported by large cap stocks. So if we go over the last 100 years, large cap stocks as reported by the Dow, going 1919 to 2019. Actually, we can go all the way back to 1916. So let's do that. So 1916 all the way out to 2016, that 100-year average, the average return, and if you can highlight this, Cody, was 7.25%. Okay, so that's the average return. If you see in the top left-hand corner where Cody is highlighting there. So that's the average return. Over to the far right of that, or next to it, not far right, is the net return of 5.3. And so we want to look at that differential. The differential between those two numbers is 26.86%. So, well, why is the differential there? So the difference between those two calculations is simply math versus geometric math. So arithmetic math versus geometrical math. That $10,000, if we compound that over 100 years, what we're saying in the average return is that we started out with a -4, -21, and then +10, +30. But if we added all those up over 100 years and took the lump sum of those figures and divided it by 100, the math says that the average should be 7.25. But the money says 10,000 at the beginning of the year turns into $1,757,110 at the end of 100 years. So in the beginning it was 10, and at the end, 100 years later, it was $1,757,110. That equates to a compounded average of 5.3. Now, as you can see, that's a far, far cry from 12, as reported by some financial, I will call them entertainers. So now, that's the Dow, and that's the Dow Industrial Average over 100 years from 1916 to 2016. So Cody, let's make it more relevant 100 years. Let's go 1926 or 1925 to 2024. That average, 7.85 again, arithmetically, and then geometrically, that number is 6.04. Or, better said, 10,000 turned into 3.5 million over that 100 years. So when we look at that, that sounds and looks amazing. Well, one of the things I want to point out is the timing of return. So that's the first thing we want to see, is the timing and sequence of returns of the Dow Industrials. Now, if we had gone through this phase and said, okay, if a person way back then had to start taking income from this account, so now they're not an accumulator, now they're a distributor. And let's apply the 4% rule, and I'll come back and talk about the 4% rule in just a few minutes. But Cody, let's go over to withdrawals, and let's say you could get this return of 6.04 over 100 years. And the only difference is now we turn you from accumulator into distributor. So what if a person was taking income during this 100-year phase? What would happen? So now let's go in this 4% rule. So on $10,000, 4% of 10,000, Cody, is what? $400, right? So let's put in just a $400 a year distribution off of this portfolio. And let's do an increase. So we're going to talk about inflation in a little while. The 100-year average on inflation, 3.3%. So that makes that 400 today go all the way to the end of that. So hit the arrow down, and let's go to the 100th year. So $400 100 years ago in 2024 would have been $9,994 in order for that to spend the same way 400 spent back in 1915, 1960. What did we start? 1916. Okay. So save that schedule. Isn't that crazy? Now look at where it says no solution. If a person had $10,000 back in 1916 and they only wanted to take out 4% starting in year one, and they wanted to take that out using a theoretically conservative distribution, but indexing it to inflation. So let's look at that far right column that says withdrawal. Here we are taking $400 a year. At what point, Cody, did they run out of money in this scenario?
Year 18.
They ran out of money in year 18, or they didn't have enough to take the 400 a year. As you can see, year 18 it was $697, and by the time we got to year 19, they only had $285 to distribute, but they needed $720. So they ran out of money. Now, that's that 100-year average. Now, what that shows me is that most of us use returns that are unrealistic in our financial planning to manage how we're going to take distributions in the distribution phase. So we have to really understand the short-term use of that money versus the long-term calculations. It's the liquidity, it's the use, it's the control of that money that matters. And so when we're looking at long-term averages, those long-term averages don't tell the whole story, especially when you move from accumulator to distributor. And this is where we need to be really, really careful with how we take distributions when we factor in costs. Now, by the way, I didn't factor in any income taxes. I'm going to come back and show that in a few minutes with no withdrawals. So if there were no withdrawals and we were just letting it accumulate, well, most people think, well, man, my heirs would be significantly wealthy if we just let that happen. And we're going to try to put to rest some of those thoughts and concerns that people have. So we can see where that could be devastating. Now, to be fair, let's pick up this period now with the S&P 500, Cody, versus the Dow. And let's go large cap stocks, 1928. So obviously we can't look at 100 years. So let's back this down, that if we're talking 1928 from 100, we can only look at, what, 97 years? So let's put in 97 years there. Still, all right, let's take the income out for a minute. Just make the zeros. So what we're going to first do, we can obviously see by you looking at that it still runs out of money if you started taking distributions way back then on your portfolio. Now, without those distributions, here's the average, and this is where financial gurus get this kind of 12% average, is that if you look again to the left top screen of the spreadsheet here, over this 97-year period, the S&P 500, over this period, 97 years, or 96 years, I should say, averaged mathematically, arithmetically, 11.87%. So that's where you hear sometimes, oh, I think I can go get 12 in the market. This is what they're talking about. With the reinvestment of dividends, we can get about 12%. But it's not the entire story, folks. It matters when and how you get that 12. And that average for you, you have to think about, well, what things haven't we taken into consideration yet? We haven't taken into consideration any distributions. We haven't taken into consideration any inflation on those distributions. We haven't taken into consideration income tax. So income tax was instituted in 1913. So income tax had already been around for a little while by 1928. So Cody, leave this window open another window, and let's go look at marginal tax history. So this is a graph of the marginal tax rates going all the way back to when income tax was instituted in 1913. So let me show you something interesting here. Let's take, let's use $10,000 as the income. Now in 1913, if you made $10,000, in complete transparency, you were a wealthy person. You were doing okay. I think the average household income in 1913 might have been around $2,000, and I might be a little gracious or audacious in that statement, maybe. We'll go back and fact check me in a minute here, Cody, on what was the average household income in 1913. As a matter of fact, you wanna look that up real quick, and I'll look it up while I'm chatting here too.
Yeah, it says the average household income in 1913, based on historical records in the United States, was approximately $791.
Wow, I was way off. So let's do that. Let's put $790 there. $790. So this is back then, married, filing jointly. So $790. Go to 2000. You're in 2025. Let's go to 1913, when income tax was first instituted. Here we go. So 1913, if you made $790 average household income, you were in a marginal tax rate of a whopping 1%. So the calculator actually calculated that as you didn't know any income tax. Now, as we work up the scale, here's what I found interesting. That there were 4 men in the U.S. in 1913 who made over $500,000 a year. So from $790 to over $500,000. Let's just start with $100,000. If you made $100,000, you were uber wealthy in 1913. Let's show that, Cody. Wow, your tax rate was a whopping 4%, but this was a progressive scale. As you worked up the system, in 1913, the federal income tax rate started at 1, and the highest marginal rate over $500,000 was 7. So actually put in 500,000. And see, we hit right at the bottom of that scale. Now, when we go over, let's go 700,000. Now we hit the highest marginal rate on $700,000 of income in 1913. Your marginal tax rate was 7%, but your actual tax bill was $38,985, which if we do the math on that, let's take that number, 700,000, and 38,985 divided by the 700,000. That's a 5.56% effective tax rate, meaning what you actually paid. If you made 700,000, you paid 38. That's the equivalent of a 5.56 or 5.7 after rounding tax or tax rate versus marginal rate of 7. Okay, so now you know where I'm getting this tax rate from. But we could say, man, if a person had that amount of money, $10,000 they'd save, that would be amazing for a person back then. But let's look at something today. Let's take that same 700,000 of income and let's jump out to 2025. Married, filing jointly. You now are in a 35% marginal tax rate. You still haven't gone to the highest rate, which is 37. But you, before anything other than a standard deduction, Married filing jointly, you owe $173,595 in tax. So you can see how tax rates, and you can see the graph at the bottom of the screen here, how those have been volatile over the years. Now, again, we have to do things inflation adjusted. I didn't do that. But let's just take the same $700,000 and look at 1944. If you made that kind of money back then, in 1944, you'd be in a 94% tax rate. You would have owed $631,000 in federal tax of the $700 you earned. But let's just go back. Cody, go put in what was the median household income in 1944 in the U.S., according to Google? Google.
What year was that?
1944. The median household income in 1944.
Median household income for families in the U.S. in 1944 was $2,500.
So let's stick that in under adjusted gross income. $2,500 in 1944. Look at that, folks. Your marginal tax rate jumped to 25% from 1%. And you had a whopping $196 in tax after deductions. But the moral of the story here is income tax rates have historically in our country averaged over 50% over the last 100 years. But marginal rates can lull you into a false sense of security in that those rates from a marginal point of view is not actually what you pay in an effective rate. But the thing to remember is that in this period of time that we're in now, where it appears that we have high tax rates, or higher than 1913, lower than 1944, when you go back and look at where we've been in a tax system, we're in the fourth lowest tax environment in what we've been in all of American history. And you can see it here in the screens, on the graphs. That graph below graphs out the highest marginal rates since 1913. And back in 1944, the highest marginal rate was 94%. So go put that in. Anything over $200,000 back in 1944. So put 250,000 in. You hit the 94% tax rate, you would have been subject to 208,000 of your 250 in federal income tax. And that's really the basis of what the Reagan administration campaigned on during the 1980s was, hey, we have these exuberantly high income tax rates. He actually called them draconian. Cody, do me another fact check. Look up the word draconian. So DRACONIAN. Draconian, like draconian. And read that definition out for us. So this is...
It means excessively harsh and severe.
Yep. So these draconian rates, President Reagan and his chief economist, a guy named Laffer, Dr. Laffer, said these were draconian rates, excessive and hard. And they were right. But we have come through that, and now we're at a more palatable tax rates. But our federal government has now spent, as we were talking about in a previous podcast, they have spent more than we've taken in. So we have $37 trillion of admitted debt. The fiscal gap accounting says that might actually be closer to $121 trillion and counting. But if we look at our liabilities versus our assets, we're way upside down, and we're spending over 121% of our GDP in new dollars being eroded into or through our financial system. So when I go back and I look at returns, we have to consider the cost of money. And the cost of money, the greatest eroding factor or cost of money, is income tax. So Cody, let's go back to that example again. And let's look at this $10,000. We can see that if we had 10,000 over 97 years of compounding large cap stocks before fees, we would have ended with $92,959,930 over that 96-year average. Your net return, so 10,000 growing to 92 million, that would have effectively been 9.99%, not bad, before fees, before taxes. Now let's go through for a minute and let's add some of those expenses in. So go up there to the expense column, Cody, and let's see what this does to the bottom line of our investment portfolio. So management fees. Let's say the portfolio is obviously you can't go by the purity of the market. So you have to go through a managed index like whether it be Vanguard or some other institution. There has to be an expense ratio built in. So let's just say this expense ratio, grins and giggles, was no advisor fees, just the fund fee. Let's call it 0.3% over 100 years. So we went from 99 million to 69 million. So those fund expenses, and let's see what that total cost was over 100 years. Let's go all the way to the bottom. So the fees over that 96 years, not 100 years, was $1,982,317 in fees. But that $1.9 million over 30 years cost us, what was it, Cody? 30 million? Because we were at 97?
30.
So it cost us almost $30 million in opportunity cost on those fees. Now, along the way, the question you have to ask yourself is who paid the tax and what was the tax? So we were talking about this in our group meeting yesterday, and Cody was like, man, you got to do a podcast on this. You got to talk about what you just shared with us. And Cody, do you remember what tax rate we used?
I don't off the top of my head.
I want to say that we just said, well, what if the tax rate was, I think, 15%, because we were talking about capital gains versus ordinary income. And so if we had a 15% tax and pay it from the account, Cody, look at that. We went from 69 million. Remember, we were at 97, almost 99. Fees of the fund dropped it. Fees on the portfolio dropped it again. So now that average return is now a net return after fees and taxes. And we're saying taxes are just 15%. We dropped down to 11 million bucks. Now, let's say this person wanted to take income now. And they wanted to take income. They didn't know this was going to happen. They just wanted to start taking income in day one. If they started taking income in day one and they were using the 4% rule, Cody, go in to ChatGPT or Google. And this one I actually want to show on the board. So you've probably heard people say the 4% rule, taking 4% from your portfolio. So bring Google up, and we're going to put this in the Google search field, and just say, what is the 4% rule? So here we go. The 4% rule is a guideline for retirement withdrawal, suggesting you can withdraw 4% of your total retirement savings in your first year and then adjust that amount for inflation annually with a high probability of your savings lasting for at least 30 years in retirement. For example, $1 million saved, you withdraw $40,000 in the first year, increasing that amount by annual inflation rate in subsequent years. Your money should last. So it's and they go through how it works, examples, considerations, limitations. Scroll up for me. I was trying to remember the physicist's name who came up with that rule, and I'm blanking on his name right now. It's not that important, but that's the basis of the 4% rule. But it was, there is William Benyon, the creator of the 4% rule, suggested how you could save and withdraw up to 4.7 due to updated factors. A few years ago, Cody, that factor was down in the 2s because interest rates had dropped so artificially low that we could no longer depend on the 4% rule being a safe withdrawal rate. So let's go back for a minute. We're going to say 4%. But let's say this person had retired. Go back to the calculator, you on the tax. There we go. Let's say this person years ago retired with $10,000 years ago. And they wanted this $11 million, but it didn't start at 11. It started with 10. And they were only going to take 4% out of their portfolio, which is what, $400? So let's start with 400. And we're going to see if this lasts for 30 years. We're going to say inflation averaged 3.3. Okay, so save that. No, where did we run out of money? Scroll down. We actually ran out of money in the 16th year in this scenario with these returns and these sequence of returns. So what I mean by sequence of returns is a sequence in how we earned 43 first, and then we had 4 negative years, and then a positive year, then a negative year. That sequence is part of what ran us out of money in 16 years versus going 30 years. So again, the key factor here, folks, to remember is that when you move from accumulation to distribution, number one, none of us have 100 years for our money to compound for us. So that's the first rule you got to remember is you don't have 100 years. You probably have, at best, if you started saving in your early teens, you might have 50 to 70 years of compounding. And I'm giving a 20-year variance there for people who are in very good health. So, number one, we don't have 100 years to compound. We have far less than that. By a third or more, we have less than that. The other thing to look at is that now we have to consider the sequence and timing of when we take distributions on our portfolio. Because I can't tell you if the day you start whether or not there's going to be the next Great Depression. And actually, in this scenario here with this make-believe person, they started with a 43% return on their $10,000 in year one. So you would think, man, they got at least 10 years of distributions out of that one account. But it doesn't work that way. The compounding of expenses, the compounding of tax as eroding factors takes money away from that portfolio. And when you consider all of those things together, the likelihood of them having a legacy account, especially if they're solely in one type of index, the likelihood of them lasting through that is slim to none. So that's the other thing we need to look at, is what happens when you have a portfolio that is strictly one asset class. Doesn't end well. So you have to be careful with that. There is more that we can talk through on this, but what I want to bring it back to today, here's the thought, folks. I talk about this often. Money basically will flow through 3 buckets. The first bucket we refer to as a taxable bucket. So no matter where your money, whether it be W-2, 1099s, it's got to flow through the taxable bucket first. Okay. Now, there are some ways to reduce some of the tax temporarily, and that's if we use a tax deferred bucket. Or another way to think about tax deferred is tax postponement. So some of the money that's going through the taxable bucket, we could shift to the tax deferred bucket and not pay the tax today. So whatever tax or tax rate that we're in today, we're going to defer that tax rate as we go to the tax deferred bucket. But the key word here is, instead of deferral, let's think of it as postpone. We're going to postpone the tax. Now, what are we postponing the tax to? Are we postponing it to a higher bracket or a lower bracket or the same? That really depends on you and the federal government. You being, if you make more money, Cody, what's going to happen to your income taxes if you make more money?
It goes up.
You pay more tax, right? So if you make less money in the future, you go down. Now, how many people plan to fail financially? Nobody plans to fail financially. But if you go into retirement and you make less money, and you have less money in the last 10 years of your working life, that's probably less money that you can save. So there might be an argument where you could say, look, my taxes are going to go down if the known tax rates that we're in stay the same. In our progressive system, maybe you end up in a lower tax rate. That's something you need to examine and something we need to put into a financial test tube to see what would happen and to understand the consequence of that. So you don't need to make that decision lightly or without really looking at the both micro and macroeconomic results of that. Now, in the 1990s, tax-free really became on the forefront again, because so many people were frustrated with our tax system, and especially retirees in the 1980s and 90s, and they were seeing these tax rates that were potentially higher on them because of their earning years. And a lot of these folks had pensions, Social Security, and their 401ks that they started contributing to in the 1970s. So little old ladies went to this one senator, and I say little old ladies because it's kind of how Senator Roth put it, is that he was being talked to by retirees and widows who were left with their husbands' IRAs and their own IRAs. He was having conversations with these retirees and saying, hey, we're unnecessarily paying tax on our required minimum distributions when we don't even want to take a distribution from our portfolio. So they came up with a way for you to have a tax-free account. There was always a tax-free account around, but no one really knew how to use it. But it's been on the tax code for 100 plus years. It's been available to us, and it's called permanent life insurance. No one really understood the use and how to maximize that. And now it's become really popular again. You can go on pretty much any Facebook or Instagram account and do a search and find somebody talking about life insurance. And there's a whole nother podcast we're going to do on that. Actually, we did one, a few weeks ago, Cody, that we could maybe reference back to when we post this, about the proper uses of permanent life insurance and term insurance. My opinion is that you need both, and that both play a critical role in your entire retirement process from accumulation to distribution. But the ideal product in that process of retirement, if you're going to use it is permanent life insurance. So that fell under the tax-free bucket here if used right. It could also fall under the tax-deferred bucket in how it is taxed. But if you use it appropriately and it's designed appropriately, two ways you can get money out of an insurance policy is through policy loans and a reduction of basis, or taking your basis out of an insurance contract will allow you tax-free access to the accumulation and growth. Whatever you leave in, grows tax-deferred, stays tax-deferred, and becomes part of your death benefit. So the other place is Roth, or Roth IRAs and Roth 401ks. Those are the only two places in the tax code that money can truly go after tax, grow tax deferred, and you as a consumer have access to it income tax free. So what I'd love to do with you today is stop right there. We'll talk about those three buckets in more detail in a future podcast. But I just wanted to give you some insight into returns net of expenses, returns net of expenses of fund fees, income tax. And it wasn't all inclusive today, but there is so much more that we could peel back in this onion when we're talking about what the real rate of return is in different indexes, after fees, after taxes. It's not as high as you think, folks. And so you have to be really careful in your income and distribution planning, using unrealistic returns to set a guideline for what your cash flows are going to be during your distribution phase. Remember, income is the outcome in your distribution phase. So be realistic, use realistic numbers, make plans that are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time sensitive. And then if you want to take that, turn it into a word, it's called SMART. Make a SMART plan. But make a SMART plan that's also smarter by executing and repeating the SMART acronym. You'll be glad you did. Hey, thanks for listening. Please hit the like button. Please subscribe and keep following KP's Blackbox and Kenneth Porter and Company for more financial tidbits and information. We love you guys. We appreciate you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Blackbox.